If God created everything, then who created God? This is the question that has haunted prophets, philosophers, and even scientists for centuries. Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, entered deep states of trance where he explored mysteries far beyond human understanding, and even in those states, he was confronted with this ultimate question: what was before creation, and what is the true nature of God? Before I take you into this journey, let me ask you, what do you personally believe came before creation? Write it in the comments, because this is one of those moments where every perspective matters, and your insight could spark a discussion that changes how others see reality. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because we bring these hidden truths to light in ways that can awaken something deep inside you. Now imagine this: a time before time itself. No stars, no planets, no galaxies, not even the concept of space or matter. Just silence. But Cayce said this silence was not empty. It was filled with the presence, the eternal consciousness that has always been. In his words, God was not born, God did not begin, God simply is. To our human minds used to beginnings and endings, this idea sounds almost impossible. Yet Cayce revealed that what we call God is the source, the infinite field from which all existence flows. In other words, asking about the origin of God is like asking what came before eternity. The very question reveals how small our perception is compared to the vastness of the infinite. And yet, Cayce gave us glimpses that can ignite something within us, glimpses that make us realize that this presence has always been guiding not only the birth of the universe, but also the path of each individual soul. Think of the Great Depression in the United States, the time when Cayce was most active. Families came to him broken, with no food, no hope, no future. In his trance sessions, Cayce did not simply give predictions about health or daily life. He spoke of the eternal. He said that the same God who existed before creation existed in those moments of despair, waiting for people to remember their true connection to the source. That is why when people asked, who created God, or where did God come from, Cayce would always direct them to a higher perspective. God had no origin. God is the very ground of existence, the eternal awareness from which time, space, and matter appeared. And this truth was not just philosophical, it was deeply practical. Because if God had no beginning, then our souls, created in God's image, also carried something eternal that no crisis, no hunger, no tragedy could ever destroy. Cayce described creation itself not as a random event, but as the unfolding of divine will. Before the stars were born, before matter condensed, Cayce said there was the word, the vibration, the thought, the first movement of the infinite consciousness. It was this vibration that gave rise to light, and from light the building blocks of the universe. And even here we see that the idea of an origin of God makes no sense. For Cayce, God is the thought before thought, the presence before movement, the cause that does not need a cause. If you're listening now, pause for a moment. Try to imagine silence so absolute that nothing exists, and then imagine realizing that even in that silence there is awareness. That awareness is God. That awareness is eternal, and you are part of it. For those who struggle with faith, this explanation is not about blind belief. It's about rethinking what existence really is. Science tells us that the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang. But Cayce, long before cosmologists, said that the universe was born from consciousness. Not chaos, not accident, consciousness. And this consciousness was God, eternal, self-existent. In one of his sessions, Cayce said plainly, God is, and beside him there is none other. No beginning, no end, just being. And within that being, the seeds of creation. Isn't it incredible? Because this means that when we ask, who created God, we are missing the point. The right question is, how do I awaken to the God that already lives within me? And this is where Cayce always brought it back to practical life. Before we move deeper, let me remind you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Every week we explore the most hidden, transformative teachings of Edgar Cayce, teachings that can open your mind and bring peace to your heart. By subscribing, you make sure you never miss the next revelation, and you help us spread these truths to more souls who are searching for answers. Because the truth is, this is not only about theology, it is about identity. If God has no origin and is eternal, then what does it mean that we are made in the image of God? Cayce explained that each soul is a spark of that same eternal consciousness. That means your soul did not start when your body was born, and it will not end when your body dies. Your essence, just like God's essence, is beyond time. This truth is at once humbling and empowering. Humbling because it shows us how small we are in the face of eternity. Empowering because it shows us that no matter what we face, we carry the same eternal flame within. Cayce often said that the soul's journey began long before it took on human form. He described the creation of souls as sparks emerging from the eternal flame. Imagine billions of sparks igniting from a limitless fire, each carrying the essence of the source, yet given freedom to explore, to choose, to experience. That was humanity's beginning, not in terms of flesh and blood, but in terms of consciousness. And here is the paradox that Cayce wanted us to understand. While souls had a beginning, God did not. The fire was always there. The source did not appear in time. The source is beyond time. This is why when people desperately wanted to know where God came from, Cayce shifted the focus. He explained that the real mystery is not God's origin, but our forgetfulness. Forgetting that we are part of something eternal and that separation is an illusion. Now pause and think. How much of your daily suffering comes from believing you are small, temporary, fragile? Cayce urged people to look deeper, to recognize that every breath you take is sustained by the same infinite consciousness that sustains galaxies. He said that if we truly remembered our connection with God, we would not fear death, we would not collapse under suffering, and we would not doubt our worth. This was the heart of his teachings. The eternal God calls us to awaken to the eternal within ourselves. So when you hear the phrase, the origin of God, remember, it's not about God's beginning, but about our awakening. During one reading, Cayce described creation in a way that almost sounds poetic. He said it began with desire, the desire of the Creator to express, to give, to share love. Out of this desire, energy moved. Out of energy came light. Out of light came form. And within that form, the soul. What does this mean for us? It means that at the deepest level, your existence is not an accident, but an expression of love. And love itself is eternal, because it is the very essence of God. Think about this. Before any universe existed, love already was. Before any sun rose or planet spun, love was the force that gave birth to everything. Doesn't that change the way you see yourself? You are not here by chance. You are here because eternal love desired your existence. Cayce also emphasized that the human mind struggles with concepts like infinity. We think in terms of birth and death, start and finish, but God is not a timeline. God is presence. He explained that when Jesus spoke of the I Am, he was revealing the same truth, God as eternal being. Not I was, not I will be, but I am. Always present, always now. When you close your eyes and become aware of awareness itself, you touch a small glimpse of that eternal I Am, and in those moments you realize there is no need to search for God's origin, because the presence has never been absent. It is here, now, in this very moment as you listen to these words. For those who came to Cayce seeking physical healing, the message was often the same. True healing begins when you remember who you really are. He would guide people not only to remedies and treatments, but also to prayer, meditation, and attunement with the source. Why? Because he knew that disease and despair often grew out of forgetting our divine connection. If God is eternal, and if our souls are part of that eternal essence, then reconnecting with God's presence within us restores balance. Cayce once said, "The Spirit of God is ever present. It is we who forget." That is the heart of it. We forget. And when we forget, we suffer. But when we remember, even the darkest night becomes filled with light. This brings us to a powerful point. If God has no beginning and no end, then every challenge you face is temporary against the backdrop of eternity. Imagine holding a grain of sand and worrying that it represents your whole life, when in truth the vast ocean stretches endlessly before you. That is how Cayce wanted us to see our struggles. They are real, they are painful, but they are not ultimate. The ultimate reality is eternal God, eternal consciousness, eternal love, and you are never separate from that. In fact, every heartbeat is proof that the eternal is flowing through you. When people asked Cayce directly, "Where was God before creation?" his answers pointed to something beyond words. He said God was, God is, God will be. But more than that, he invited seekers to feel this truth, not just think about it. Because feeling the presence of God transforms despair into hope, loneliness into connection, and fear into peace. This is why these teachings are not abstract, they are deeply personal. If God is eternal, then God is with you now, in your room, in your mind, in your very breath. And if that is true, then you are never truly alone. One of the most moving aspects of Cayce's work was how he brought this eternal truth into the lives of ordinary people. Picture a mother arriving at his home in Virginia Beach during the darkest years of the Great Depression. Her children are hungry, her husband has lost his job, and she feels abandoned by God. She asks Cayce in despair, "If God is real, if God is eternal, then why do we suffer like this?" In trance, Cayce would respond with words that cut deeper than any philosophy. Suffering does not mean absence of God. In fact, he explained that God's eternal presence is the very reason we have the strength to endure. He would remind her that the soul is eternal, that this life is but one chapter, and that within every hardship there lies an invitation to remember the source. Those who left his readings often felt not just guided medically or financially, but profoundly comforted. They left knowing they were not forgotten, because the eternal cannot forget. This teaching is not meant to dismiss pain, but to transform the way we perceive it. Cayce insisted that the eternal perspective was the only way to find peace amid chaos. Imagine how powerful it is to realize that the God who existed before the birth of the stars is the same God walking with you through your darkest nights. It means that every tear is seen, every prayer is heard, every soul is known. This is not theory, it is intimacy with the infinite. And this intimacy was what Cayce wanted people to rediscover. The eternal God does not stay distant. The eternal God flows through creation, through you, through every beating heart. But here is where it becomes even more transformative. If God has no beginning, then God also has no end. And if we are sparks of that eternal flame, then neither do we. Cayce explained that death is not the end of consciousness, it is merely a transition. Just as day turns to night and night turns to dawn, the soul moves from one state of being to another. This realization lifted the fear of death from countless people. He told them, the soul existed before birth and will continue after death, because it shares in the eternal. Imagine the hope that must have stirred in those who felt life had abandoned them. Suddenly they realized that their story did not end at the grave. Their story was woven into eternity. Cayce also tied this truth to responsibility. If God is eternal, and we share in that essence, then our choices matter on an eternal scale. The way we love, forgive, or harm others does not vanish with time. It shapes the journey of the soul. That is why he stressed spiritual growth, meditation, and prayer, not as rituals, but as ways to realign with the eternal presence. He encouraged people to live with compassion, reminding them that every act echoes in eternity. When you see life this way, even the smallest choices gain incredible weight. It makes you pause before speaking in anger, before acting in selfishness, because you realize you are handling eternal substance, the soul of another, the image of God. Now let's bring it back to you. If you have ever wondered, where did God come from? Understand this. Cayce revealed that God did not come from anywhere. God is. God always was. God always will be. The question itself dissolves when you stand before infinity. And yet the fact that you asked means something profound. It means your soul is searching for connection, searching for its source. And that source is already here. Close your eyes and feel your breath. That breath is sustained by the same eternal consciousness that moves galaxies across the heavens. Doesn't that shift the way you see yourself? You are not small. You are eternal in origin, eternal in destiny. Before we move forward, let me pause to say this. If these words are opening something in your heart, if they are stirring questions or giving you peace, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. We are building a community of seekers, people who are ready to go deeper, ready to remember what their souls already know. When you subscribe, you are not just following a channel. You are joining a circle of souls walking together toward the eternal truth that Cayce devoted his life to share. Don't walk this journey alone. Subscribe and stay connected. Because the deeper you go into Cayce's teachings, the more you realize that the origin of God is not a riddle to be solved, but an invitation to awaken. God's eternity is not something out there. It is something you can touch within. Cayce said that Christ consciousness, the awareness of oneness with God, was the key. When you live with this awareness, life changes. Fear loses its grip. Anger dissolves faster. Gratitude rises naturally. You begin to see others not as strangers, but as fellow sparks of the same eternal flame. This is what Cayce meant when he urged people to live as if the kingdom of God is within. Not later, not elsewhere. Here, now, within you. Cayce believed that the greatest tragedy of human life was not sin or even death, it was forgetting. Forgetting that we are eternal, forgetting that we are connected to the infinite, forgetting that every soul comes from the same source. This forgetfulness is what breeds fear, hatred, and despair. He compared humanity to children who wander away from home, lost in the dark, afraid, when in truth the light of the Father is still shining, waiting for them to remember their way back. And this is why he insisted that meditation and prayer were not just religious habits but lifelines. When you pray, when you meditate, you are not begging a distant God for attention. You are tuning back into the eternal frequency that has never left you. You are realigning with what has always been. This is why Cayce often said, "Spirit is life, mind is the builder, physical is the result." At first this sounds abstract, but it is deeply practical. He meant that spirit, the eternal presence of God, is the foundation. The mind, your thoughts and beliefs, are the tools that shape your experience, and the body, your physical reality, is the result of what has been built. So when we forget spirit, our minds drift into fear, and our lives reflect that fear. But when we remember spirit, when we center ourselves in the eternal, our minds shift toward love and peace, and life reflects that. This principle changed the lives of thousands who came to him. It wasn't magic. It wasn't superstition. It was the eternal law of alignment. What you align with, you manifest. Let's bring this closer to home. Think of the times you felt completely alone. Times when it seemed like no one understood, no one cared, no one was listening. Cayce would say in those moments, the eternal was still there. Just as radio waves fill the air even when you can't hear them, God's presence surrounds you even when you can't feel it. All it takes is tuning in. That's why he encouraged people to create daily moments of stillness, even just 5 minutes of silence to reconnect. Because when you turn inward, you discover that the eternal is not far away. It is right here. It has been carrying you all along. One of Cayce's most famous statements was that mind is the builder, but what he meant at the deepest level was that the mind is powerful because it is part of the eternal. Our thoughts are not just random sparks, they are connected to the source itself. This is why he taught that prayer works, not because it convinces God to act, but because it realigns us with what God already is. Imagine the peace that comes when you stop thinking of God as a being who might say yes or no, and start realizing that God is the eternal presence of life and love itself. The moment you align with that presence, healing begins, transformation begins, peace begins. So let's return to the haunting question. If God created everything, then who created God? After everything we've explored, can you see how the question dissolves? God was not created. God is. And that is why your soul can rest. Because you are not floating in a meaningless universe, you are embraced by eternity itself. Cayce's answer was not meant to satisfy the mind alone. It was meant to awaken the heart. To realize that if God has no beginning, then love has no beginning. And if love has no end, then neither does your soul. Isn't that the most comforting truth you could ever hold on to? But this truth also calls for courage, because if you share in the eternal, then your choices matter eternally. Cayce urged people to live with responsibility, not in fear, but in love. To forgive, because forgiveness echoes into eternity. To love, because love is the essence of eternity. To serve, because serving another soul is honoring God Himself. And if you think your small acts don't matter, remember this. Eternity is built out of moments. Every smile, every kind word, every prayer shapes the eternal fabric. That is how powerful you are, because you carry the eternal within you. Cayce often illustrated this truth by reminding people of Christ's words, "The kingdom of God is within you." He would explain that this was not poetry, not metaphor, but reality. If God is eternal and we are created in that image, then the eternal kingdom is alive inside of us. The tragedy is that most people never look within. They search the stars, they build philosophies, they chase wealth and power, but they ignore the silent presence in their own hearts. Cayce said that awakening is not about finding God somewhere out there. It is about remembering that God has always been here, within, closer than your own breath. And when you realize this, fear begins to lose its grip. Because how can you fear the end when you are part of what has no end? Take a moment to imagine what your life would look like if you lived every day with that awareness. The stress of money, the anxiety of the future, the pain of the past, suddenly they shrink compared to the vastness of eternity. You would see setbacks not as the end of your story, but as chapters in a much larger book. You would see other people not as enemies or strangers, but as fellow sparks of the same eternal flame. That is the power of this teaching. It changes not only how you see God, but how you see yourself and the world around you. And this shift, Cayce believed, was the foundation of true peace. When people came to him asking for predictions about war, about the economy, about personal futures, he often redirected them. He would say, "What matters most is not what will happen, but how you align yourself with the eternal now. Because history rises and falls, nations are born and die, but God remains. And if you are aligned with that eternal presence, then no matter what comes, you are safe in the deepest sense." This was not a promise of an easy life, it was a promise of meaning. Even in suffering, even in loss, you are part of something that cannot be destroyed. That realization carried people through the Great Depression, through illness, through heartbreak. And it can carry you through whatever storm you face today. But let's not miss the intimacy here. Cayce did not describe God as a cold force or an abstract energy. He described God as a presence of love, a consciousness that knows and cares. That means when you pray, you are not sending words into the void. You are opening yourself to the love that has always been. It means that when you sit in silence and feel that stillness, you are touching eternity. And in that moment, the question, "Who created God?" becomes irrelevant. Because you realize you are not dealing with a being who had a start, but with the very ground of existence. You are resting in what has no beginning and no end. Now I want to ask you, if you really believe that God has no beginning and no end, how would it change the way you live tomorrow? Would you treat people differently? Would you let go of grudges faster? Would you stop worrying about things that don't matter in the light of eternity? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear from you, and your answer might inspire someone else who is listening right now. Cayce often reminded seekers that eternity is not something we wait for after death. It is happening now. Every choice we make, every thought we hold, every action we take is already part of the eternal flow. That is why he insisted that the way we live daily life matters more than any doctrine we claim to believe. Eternity is not delayed until the grave. Eternity is woven into this very breath you are taking. Think about that. The same eternal presence that existed before galaxies spun into motion is alive in you at this very instant. That is the power Cayce wanted us to realize, because once you feel it, life can never be the same. And here lies the heart of his message. When people asked about the origin of God, what they were really yearning for was reassurance. Reassurance that life has meaning, that suffering is not random, that love is not temporary. Cayce's answer, though simple, carried a depth that touches the soul. God has no origin. God is. And because God is eternal, you are never outside of his presence. Even in moments of deepest despair, even when you feel abandoned, the eternal is still carrying you. That is why so many people who left his readings felt peace. They realized they were not adrift in a meaningless universe, but embraced by an eternal source of love. Think of how liberating this can be. If God is eternal, then hope is eternal. If God is eternal, then love is eternal. If God is eternal, then you, as part of that essence, are also eternal. Death cannot erase you. Failure cannot define you. Fear cannot destroy you. Because your true self is not built on time. It is built on eternity. This realization changes everything. It gives you courage to face challenges, strength to forgive, and patience to endure. It is not wishful thinking. It is the deepest truth of existence. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a choice. To live as if life is random, temporary, fragile, or to live as if every moment is eternal, sacred, filled with meaning. Cayce urged us to choose the latter, to live with compassion, to love with courage, to forgive freely, to remember daily that the eternal God lives within. And if you forget, return again and again to silence, to prayer, to that still small voice inside you, because that is where eternity whispers, reminding you who you are and where you come from. If this message has touched your heart, if it has opened a new perspective, I invite you now, subscribe to this channel and walk with us. We are building a community of souls who seek more than surface answers, who want to dive into the eternal truths Cayce revealed. When you subscribe, you are saying yes to a journey that is bigger than time, bigger than fear, bigger than doubt. You are saying yes to remembering what your soul has always known, that God is eternal and so are you. So I leave you with this thought. The next time someone asks, "Who created God?" you will know the answer. Not a debate, not an argument, but a truth that silences the question itself. God was not created. God is. And in that eternal I am, you are forever home. Why do we exist? Why did God create human beings in the first place? This is not just a philosophical question. It is the deepest mystery of our lives. Prophets have wrestled with it, philosophers have debated it, and even scientists have touched on it without being able to resolve it. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, in his trances that opened doors far beyond human reason, was also confronted with this question. And what he revealed is something that does not just answer curiosity. It changes the way we see ourselves, our purpose, and our relationship with the eternal. Before we go deeper, let me ask you, what do you personally believe is the purpose of human life? Why are we here? Share your thoughts in the comments because I will be reading each one, and I'll mark your comment with a heart to show I've seen it. And while you're here, make sure to like this video, subscribe and share it, because together we are building a community of seekers who want to remember what their souls already know. Now imagine this. Before humanity walked the earth, before the first man or woman breathed, there was only the eternal presence. Cayce described it as an ocean of consciousness, limitless, timeless, filled with love and creative potential. God did not create human beings out of boredom or loneliness. In one of his most impactful readings from the 1930s, during a time when families in Virginia Beach came to him desperate for answers, Cayce explained that humanity was created for one central reason, so that souls could grow into the likeness of their Creator. To Cayce, God desired expression, an opportunity for the eternal to manifest in infinite forms, each carrying the spark of the divine. We were created not to be puppets, but to be companions, co-creators, free to choose love or selfishness, and through those choices, to learn the power of aligning with the source. Think of how radical this idea was during the Great Depression. While families in Hopkinsville or Virginia Beach were struggling for bread and hope, Cayce would remind them that they were more than bodies trying to survive. He would tell them that the soul existed long before birth, and that life on earth was a classroom where the lesson plan was always about one thing: learning to express love. This was not sentimental, it was practical. Because when someone came asking why life was filled with so much pain, Cayce would say that God did not create us to suffer. God created us to discover patience in the face of trials, compassion in the presence of suffering, faith in the shadow of uncertainty. These were not punishments, They were opportunities to grow into the divine image that already lived within. And here's something that shook many who listened to him. Cayce said that human beings were not created once in a single moment, but that souls existed as sparks of divine consciousness before ever taking on physical form. He described the soul's beginning as sparks leaping out of a great eternal flame. Each spark carried the same essence of love, but each was given freedom. And with freedom came choice. Some souls aligned with the source immediately, radiating light and service. Others wandered, forgetting their origin, getting caught in desire, fear, or selfishness. And yet, even those who forgot were never abandoned. The entire journey of humanity, Cayce said, was about remembering where we came from, returning to the Father's house, not as servants, but as children who had learned to love by choice. Pause and let that sink in. Why did God create us? According to Cayce, because God is love and love must be expressed. Creation itself is an act of love, and human beings are the unique mirrors through which that love can grow in consciousness. In one of his most moving sessions, he said, "The soul was created for companionship with the Creator. That is why we exist. Not to please a distant deity, not to wander in confusion, but to awaken to the realization that we are sparks of eternity, growing into conscious oneness with the source of all." Think about this for a moment. If Cayce was right, then every human life is not an accident, but part of a vast cosmic purpose. He explained that the soul existed before physical birth, and that incarnation was an opportunity to experience, to learn, to evolve. In other words, God created human beings as channels for growth, as instruments for divine experience. Not because God needed us in the sense of deficiency, but because creation was the natural overflow of divine love. During one of his sessions that changed the life of an entire family, Cayce explained that the essence of life was relationship. Relationship with the Creator, with each other, and with the world around us. Without relationship, the soul remains dormant. With relationship, it awakens. And here lies the beauty of Cayce's vision. Human beings are not only here to survive, to work, or to die. We are here to discover our divine nature through experience. Imagine a child learning to walk. The child falls, stumbles, gets up again. Each fall is not failure. It is part of the process of growth. Cayce saw human life in the same way. Our mistakes, our pain, our confusion are not proof that God abandoned us. They are proof that we are still in the process of learning how to reflect the divine image within. This is why he emphasized forgiveness so strongly. He said that God's purpose in creating humanity was not perfection from the start, but the journey toward perfection. And in that journey, mistakes are inevitable, but they are also opportunities to choose again, to align again, to love again. During the years of war, when uncertainty spread across the globe, people came to Cayce asking, "Why would God allow such suffering?" And Cayce's answer was consistent. God did not create human beings for destruction. Humanity was created for growth, for companionship with the divine. The wars, the hatred, the violence were products of human choice, of forgetting our true nature. Yet even then, Cayce insisted, God remained present, offering every soul a way back to alignment. He would remind people that every soul is eternal, and that while nations rise and fall, the purpose of the soul remains unchanged, to awaken to love, to remember its origin, to return home. Imagine Virginia Beach in the 1930s. Families gathered in Cayce's modest home, desperate for hope. A mother might ask, "Why did God make us if life is only suffering?" And through Cayce the answer would come, life is not for suffering. Life is for growth. Life is for remembering that even in suffering, you are never separated from the source. He explained that when God created human beings, He gave them the gift of free will. And free will means the ability to choose light or darkness, love or fear. That is why our journey on earth is so challenging. But it is also why our growth is so meaningful. Because every time you choose compassion over anger, every time you choose forgiveness over bitterness, every time you choose hope over despair, you are fulfilling the very reason you were created. This is not abstract philosophy. It is deeply practical. Cayce insisted that every act of kindness, no matter how small, aligns the soul with its purpose. When you care for someone who is hurting, when you comfort a stranger, when you pray for those in need, you are doing what you were created to do. You are becoming a conscious companion of God. And that, Cayce said, was the purpose behind human creation. Not to worship from afar, but to walk together with the eternal in the everyday moments of life. But here is where the mystery deepens. Cayce also revealed that humanity's creation was tied to something even larger, the unfolding of divine consciousness itself. He said that when God created human beings, He created channels through which the universe could know itself. In other words, your experiences, your choices, your growth are not just personal. They are cosmic. They are part of how the infinite expresses itself in time and space. Imagine that. Every joy you feel, every lesson you learn, every act of love you give, it all contributes to the expansion of divine awareness. You are not just a human being. You are a living expression of God, discovering Himself through you. If this is true, then the question, why did God create human beings, becomes much more than curiosity. It becomes a call to responsibility. Cayce explained that since every soul carries the spark of the divine, everything we do matters. Every choice, every thought, every word leaves an imprint, not only on our own lives but on the greater whole. During one of his most impactful sessions in the early 1940s, he described humanity as channels of the Creator's expression. That means when you love, you're expressing God's nature. When you forgive, you're expressing God's heart. And when you create, whether it's art, music, or even a simple meal shared with gratitude, you are reflecting the creative power that gave birth to the universe itself. But Cayce was also clear about the danger of forgetting. He said that many souls, upon receiving the gift of free will, turned away from the source. Instead of using creativity to express love, they used it for selfishness, for control, for fear. This forgetting is what gave rise to suffering, to conflict, to the illusion of separation. Yet even in that forgetting, the divine purpose never changed. God did not create human beings to be lost forever. God created them to eventually remember, to awaken to their true nature. And so, every lifetime, every challenge, every trial becomes another opportunity to return to the path of love. Think of how this changes the way we see daily life. Imagine you're struggling at work, feeling unappreciated or carrying the weight of financial stress. From a human perspective, it feels meaningless, exhausting, unfair. But from Cayce's perspective, even these struggles are classrooms. They are opportunities to develop patience, perseverance, humility, and faith. In one of his readings that deeply moved a man from New York during the Great Depression, Cayce reminded him that the soul's purpose is not measured in success or failure, but in growth. God created human beings to grow, and growth often happens in the soil of difficulty. Without challenges, love remains untested. With challenges, love becomes strong. Cayce tied this directly to the teachings of Christ. He said that when Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God being within, he was revealing the same truth that Cayce saw in trance, that humanity was created to reflect divinity, here and now. Not in some distant heaven, not after death, but in daily choices. This is why Cayce encouraged prayer and meditation, not as rituals to please God, but as ways to remember who we are. When you quiet the mind and turn inward, you reconnect with the eternal spark within. You remember that you were created not to be small, but to carry the image of the infinite. Here's something powerful to consider. Cayce often said that creation itself was born out of desire, the desire of God to express love. That means your existence is not random, not meaningless, not disposable. You exist because eternal love desired your presence. Before your first breath, before the formation of your body, even before the foundations of the earth, love already wanted you here. Isn't that extraordinary? When you see life this way, even your flaws, even your wounds, even your struggles become part of a much greater story, the story of love learning to know itself through you. And that leads us back to Cayce's central revelation. God created human beings for companionship, not forced companionship, not robotic obedience, but chosen companionship. He explained that the soul's journey is about freely choosing to align with the Creator's nature. That is why free will is so important, because without freedom, love cannot be real. God could have made humanity perfect from the start, incapable of error, but that would not be love. It would be programming. Instead, God created us with the freedom to turn away, so that when we turn back, it is genuine. And that choice, Cayce said, is what makes the human journey sacred. This is why Cayce often reminded seekers that Earth itself is a school. Every soul enrolled here, whether rich or poor, healthy or sick, young or old, is here to learn lessons that cannot be learned in any other way. During the years of the Great Depression, when hopelessness weighed on entire communities, people would ask him why a loving God would allow so much suffering. His response was not dismissive. He acknowledged the pain, the hunger, the fear. But he explained that God's purpose in creating human beings was not to shield them from all difficulty, but to guide them through it, so they could discover strength, compassion, and resilience. In his words, the soul is tested not to break it, but to awaken it. Take a moment to think about your own life, the heartbreaks, the setbacks, the nights when you felt abandoned. From a limited human perspective, these moments feel like punishment. But Cayce reframed them as opportunities for growth. He said that just as muscles strengthen through resistance, the soul strengthens through trials. God created human beings not to suffer endlessly, but to learn to transform suffering into wisdom. And wisdom, once gained, becomes eternal. It cannot be lost, even after death. This is why he emphasized that the soul carries every lesson forward, lifetime after lifetime, building toward the fullness of divine companionship. Cayce's readings also revealed something profound, that the creation of humanity was linked to the universal law of love. He explained that love is the very fabric of reality, the vibration that sustains galaxies, the energy that binds creation together. When God created human beings, he planted within them the capacity to live in harmony with this law. But he also allowed them to resist it. That freedom explains why humanity often finds itself in conflict, in division, in fear. Yet Cayce insisted that no matter how far we stray, the law of love remains constant. It calls us back, again and again, until we remember. During a session that deeply moved a family in Virginia Beach, Cayce described the soul as a traveler carrying a light. Sometimes the traveler forgets to tend the flame and the light dims, but the flame is never extinguished because it comes from the eternal fire of God. The purpose of human life, then, is to remember to keep that flame alive, to nurture it with prayer, with kindness, with forgiveness. This simple but powerful image helped countless people understand why they were created. They were not accidents. They were not abandoned. They were bearers of light, meant to reflect the eternal flame in a world that often feels dark. And here is where Cayce connected everything back to Christ consciousness. He said that Jesus embodied the perfect model of why God created human beings. Christ showed what it means to live fully aligned with the source, to love without condition, to forgive without limit, to serve without seeking reward. In Cayce's view, humanity was created so that every soul could eventually awaken to that same awareness. Not to become Christ, but to live in Christ consciousness, the awareness of unity with God. That is our destiny. That is why we were made. And every lifetime, every challenge, every act of love is a step toward that destiny. So when we ask, why did God create human beings? Cayce's answer is both humbling and empowering. God created us out of love, for love, to become love. We are here not just to exist, not just to survive, but to awaken to the truth that we are eternal souls, created for companionship with the infinite. And the path of awakening is not found in extraordinary moments alone. It is found in the simple choices of daily life, choosing patience with your children, kindness with your neighbors, forgiveness with those who hurt you. In those choices, you fulfill the very reason you were created. Cayce often pointed out that the story of humanity does not begin with our first breath, nor does it end with our last. He described the journey of the soul as one that stretches far beyond a single lifetime. In one of his most remembered readings from the early 1930s, he explained that the soul is eternal, and that each incarnation is a chapter in a much larger book. If God created human beings for companionship, then every life becomes another step toward deepening that companionship. Each lifetime offers new lessons, new relationships, and new chances to grow closer to the source. Reincarnation, in this view, is not punishment, but mercy. It is the divine way of ensuring that no soul is left behind, that every spark has endless opportunities to remember its origin. Imagine a soul in ancient times, learning through struggle and survival. Then imagine the same soul centuries later, experiencing compassion in a new culture, or discovering forgiveness in a moment of betrayal. Cayce said that these threads are not random. They are carefully woven into a tapestry of growth. God created human beings to learn, and through lifetimes the soul expands its capacity for love. This is why some people feel an unexplained pull towards certain places, certain people, or certain causes. According to Cayce, it is the soul remembering fragments of its journey, reminders of why it was created and what it is still meant to learn. This perspective changes everything about how we see humanity. Instead of viewing life as a short test with eternal consequences, Cayce saw it as an ongoing education. The Creator, he explained, is like a teacher who never gives up on the student. If you fail once, you are given another chance, and another, until you learn the lesson. But the lesson is always the same: to love, to forgive, to live in harmony with the source. That is why Cayce emphasized patience, not only patience with others, but patience with ourselves. He knew that growth takes time, and that God's purpose in creating us was not instant perfection, but eternal evolution. Consider the context of the Second World War. People asked Cayce how humanity could possibly fulfill its purpose amid such destruction. His response was striking. Even in war, the soul's purpose does not change. In fact, the urgency becomes greater. In times of hatred, love shines more brightly. In times of division, unity becomes more precious. Cayce reminded seekers that God did not create human beings for war, but to overcome it through the power of love. Wars may arise from human forgetfulness, but the eternal purpose, to awaken to God's companionship, remains. And every act of kindness in those dark times became a direct fulfillment of why humanity was made. Perhaps the most moving aspect of Cayce's explanation is how personal it is. He was not speaking only of humanity in general, but of every individual. He would often tell people who came to him in despair that they were not accidents, not mistakes, not forgotten. He would say that God had desired their existence from the beginning, and that their soul carried an eternal spark that no failure or suffering could erase. Imagine hearing that in a time when you felt worthless or abandoned. It was not only comforting, it was life-changing. That message has echoed through the decades because it speaks to the deepest longing of the human heart, the longing to know that we matter, that we were created with intention. Cayce never tired of reminding people that with the gift of creation came the gift of responsibility. If God created human beings as companions and co-creators, then our actions carry eternal weight. In one of his sessions during the 1940s, he explained that every thought is creative, every word is an energy, every action shapes the fabric of reality. That means the way you treat another person is not a small matter. It is a reflection of the very purpose for which you were created. When you speak with kindness, you are fulfilling God's intention. When you harbor resentment, you step away from it. For Cayce, this was not abstract theory. It was the practical truth of daily life. He often put it simply: mind is the builder, spirit is the foundation, but the mind builds and the body reflects the result. So why did God create human beings? To take part in this building process, to learn how to construct lives, communities, and futures in harmony with divine love. In Virginia Beach, when people came to him desperate for healing, he would give practical remedies, yes, but he also urged them to pray, to meditate, to align their minds with God's presence. He explained that healing of the body was incomplete without healing of the spirit, and healing of the spirit was always about remembering why we were created, to live in conscious connection with the source. Think of how revolutionary this was in his time. While much of the world saw human beings as limited, fragile, or insignificant, Cayce declared that humanity carried the eternal spark of God. That means your choices ripple far beyond your lifetime. A moment of compassion might inspire generations. A decision to forgive might heal wounds carried across lifetimes. In Cayce's vision, nothing is wasted. Even your struggles, even your mistakes, are woven into the great tapestry of divine purpose. God created human beings so that through these very choices, through trial and error, through falling and rising again, the soul could awaken to its true nature. And here is the extraordinary promise hidden in his words. If we were created for companionship with God, then separation is an illusion. No matter how lost you feel, no matter how far you think you've strayed, the eternal purpose still holds you. Cayce compared it to a parent watching a child learn to walk. The child may stumble, fall, even wander in the wrong direction, but the parent's love never ceases. The parent does not abandon the child. Instead, every step, even the missteps, are part of the journey. This is why Cayce insisted that remembering our purpose brings peace. Because once you understand that you were created for love, every experience, whether joyful or painful, can become part of your awakening. So pause and reflect. What would change if you lived each day knowing that God created you for companionship, for growth, for love? How would it shift the way you see your challenges, your relationships, your future? Cayce believed that asking these questions was not optional. It was essential. Because life without remembering its purpose becomes empty, but life lived with awareness of its purpose becomes sacred. And that awareness is available right now in this very moment, because the same eternal presence that created you is within you. Cayce often described the human journey as a circle returning to its center. The soul begins as a spark from the eternal flame, ventures into experience through lifetimes, and ultimately finds its way back into conscious unity with God. This is the true answer to the question, why did God create human beings? It was not for blind obedience, not for meaningless suffering, but for growth, awakening, and finally, companionship. The Creator desired partners who would choose love freely, who would return not as servants but as children aware of their divine origin. That is why free will was given. That is why Earth was created as a classroom. That is why your life, with all its triumphs and struggles, matters more than you can imagine. Cayce tied this truth to the promise of eternity. If God is eternal, and if humanity was created in God's image, then the soul is also eternal. Death does not end your story, it transitions it. He reminded seekers in Virginia Beach that the grave is not a wall, but a doorway, and beyond that doorway, the soul carries forward every lesson, every act of love, every glimpse of awakening. This is why he urged people not to waste their days in fear or bitterness. Every choice echoes in eternity. When you forgive, you bring eternity into the present. When you love, you align with the very reason you exist. And when you pray or meditate, you are not reaching for a distant God. You are tuning back into the eternal presence that has been with you since before the beginning of time. Imagine how this perspective could transform our world. If every person remembered that they were created for love, wars would lose their fuel, hatred would lose its grip, and fear would lose its power. Cayce believed that the future of humanity depended on remembering this truth collectively. He said that humanity was at a crossroads. We could continue in forgetfulness, creating conflict and division, or we could awaken to our divine purpose and bring heaven into earth through our choices. And this awakening was not only for prophets or saints, it was for every soul, including you. So when you ask yourself, why did God create me? Remember Cayce's answer. Because love desired your existence. Because the Creator wanted companions who could grow, who could choose, who could awaken. Your life is not random, it is not meaningless. It is part of a much larger story, the story of eternity expressing itself through you. And in the end, when the soul finally awakens fully, when love is chosen completely, Cayce said we return to God not as lost children, but as conscious companions. That is the destiny of humanity. That is why we were created. Before we close, let me leave you with this invitation. If these words have stirred something in your heart, if they have reminded you of your eternal purpose, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments what this teaching means to you, because I'll be reading everyone, and I'll mark your comment with a heart to show that you are seen. Together, we are building a community that remembers God created us for love, for growth, and for eternal companionship. Can a soul, the very essence of who we are, ever be destroyed? This is not just a philosophical question. It is one of the most disturbing mysteries ever explored by Edgar Cayce, the man known as the sleeping prophet. In one of his most shocking readings, he was asked directly about the destiny of souls, and his answer stunned everyone present. He spoke of the eternal nature of the soul, its divine origin, and yet he also warned of a danger few had ever considered, the possibility of a soul becoming so detached from its source that it loses its light. That revelation, documented during the Great Depression, when thousands sought hope in Virginia Beach, sent ripples of fear and reflection through all who heard it. And today, decades later, we are still asking, if the soul is eternal, what did Cayce mean when he warned about destruction? Before we go further, let me invite you. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe a soul can be destroyed, or do you believe it is indestructible? I'll heart every comment because your perspective is part of this journey. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this channel is about uncovering truths that were once hidden, truths that may change the way you see life, death, and eternity. When Cayce entered his trance states, whether in Hopkinsville or later in Virginia Beach, he would speak of realities far beyond human comprehension. In one session that changed an entire family's life, he explained that the soul was created as part of God's plan from the very beginning. To Cayce, souls were not accidents of biology or temporary sparks of existence. They were children of the divine, fragments of eternal light meant to grow, learn, and return to their Creator. But in some readings, especially those recorded in the early 1930s, he added a layer of warning. While souls could not be annihilated in the traditional sense, they could wander so far from their original purpose that they experienced something like spiritual death. He compared it to a star that loses its shine, existing in form but cut off from its source of radiance. This, he explained, was not God's desire, but the result of human choices, of repeatedly turning away from love, service, and spiritual growth. For the people of his time, many of whom had lost jobs, homes, and hope during the Great Depression, these words carried immense weight. They weren't just mystical ideas, they were a mirror to their own despair and a challenge to rise again. In a 1932 reading that still circulates in the archives of the ARE, Cayce described how every soul carries within it a record, a connection to what he often called the Akashic records. In that vision, destruction was not physical, but relational. When a soul severs its bond with the divine, it loses its orientation, drifting into confusion and emptiness. People in the room that day, struggling with questions of poverty, death, and war on the horizon, felt both terror and relief. Terror, because it suggested the consequences of our choices could echo far beyond this life. Relief, because Cayce insisted that as long as even the smallest spark of longing for God remained, that soul could never be lost. No soul is ever beyond the reach of the Creator, he repeated more than once. But his warnings were clear. Neglect your spiritual growth, live only for selfishness, and you risk dimming that eternal flame until it flickers into obscurity. For some, it was the first time they considered that heaven and hell were not punishments imposed from outside, but conditions created by the state of one's own soul. During the years of war, many soldiers' families came to Cayce, broken by grief, desperate for assurance that their loved ones had not been lost forever. In one such session, his words shocked the family. The soul cannot be destroyed, but it may wander in darkness until light is chosen again. That phrase, until light is chosen again, remains one of his most quoted lines. It reframed suffering not as divine punishment, but as an opportunity to awaken. He described the soul as energy, eternal in essence, incapable of true extinction. And yet, the choices we make can lead us to live as though we are spiritually dead, trapped in cycles of despair and separation. Imagine hearing this in the 1940s, when the world was burning and hope was scarce. For many, it was both a warning and a promise, The soul survives, but how it experiences survival depends on the path we take. This duality, eternal existence versus the risk of eternal emptiness, is what made Cayce's vision so powerful and so controversial in his time and even today. The idea that a soul could drift so far from its source that it appears destroyed was not meant by Cayce to inspire fear, but rather to awaken responsibility. In the 1930s, he emphasized repeatedly that God did not create souls to suffer or vanish. He created them for joy, growth, and reunion with the divine. But just as a flame left unattended can go out, a soul that continually rejects the call of spirit can find itself in darkness so profound it feels like extinction. Cayce often compared this state to sleep without awakening, a condition where the soul loses awareness of its true nature. Yet he always reminded his audiences that God's mercy was infinite, and as long as even the faintest whisper of desire for light remained, that soul could be rekindled. In Virginia Beach, during one unforgettable session, he explained that the destruction people feared was not the end of being, but the loss of connection, like a radio cut off from its signal, existing but silent. This metaphor shocked many, but it also gave clarity. Souls are never erased, but they can silence themselves to the point of despair if they abandon their higher purpose. What made Cayce's statements so radical was how they contrasted with the mainstream religious teachings of his time. Many preachers insisted that souls were destined for eternal bliss or eternal punishment, without shades of possibility. Cayce, however, spoke of evolution, of growth across lifetimes, of learning that stretched beyond death itself. He described reincarnation not as a theory, but as a reality documented in the Akashic records, and within that framework, the destruction of the soul took on a different meaning. It wasn't annihilation, it was stagnation. A soul refusing to evolve lifetime after lifetime eventually risks falling into a void where its divine spark lies dormant. In the archives of the ARE, accounts remain of people who left his sessions shaken, realizing that heaven and hell were not simply destinations, but conditions of the soul. Imagine living during the Great Depression, hearing this at a time when despair seemed endless. It reframed suffering not as punishment, but as an urgent call to awaken to spiritual responsibility. During the war years, Cayce often received questions about soldiers who had died suddenly in battle. Families wanted reassurance that their loved ones had not been destroyed by violence. In one such session, recorded in Virginia Beach, he made clear that even the most tragic death could not extinguish a soul. The physical body could be broken, but the essence survived, carrying forward its lessons, choices, and unfulfilled desires. Yet he added, with a tone that silenced the room, "It is possible for a soul to forget its purpose so completely that it wanders without direction." For grieving parents, these words were bittersweet, comforting because their son still lived in spirit, but sobering because the responsibility for spiritual growth was greater than they had ever imagined. The message was clear: no one is automatically safe, but no one is ever completely lost either. Choice, Cayce emphasized, is eternal, and with every choice comes the chance to return to God or drift away into emptiness. In one of his most cited readings, he used the image of a river. The soul, he said, is like a drop of water that flows from the great ocean of God. It is meant to wander, to explore, to nourish the land, and then to return. But if that drop resists the flow, clinging to stagnation, it may evaporate into dryness, separated from its source. Does that mean the water ceases to exist? No, it still exists, but in a state that no longer fulfills its purpose. For Cayce, that was the closest thing to soul destruction. Not an end, but a tragedy of wasted potential, of light hidden under endless shadows. To those who listened, this explanation was both terrifying and hopeful. It meant that we cannot escape the consequences of our choices, but it also meant that at any moment, even in darkness, we can choose to flow back toward the ocean of God's love. That is why his warnings were always paired with encouragement. Prayer, service to others, and aligning daily life with spiritual principles could keep the soul connected to its eternal source, ensuring that destruction remained only a possibility never realized. Cayce's vision of the soul's destiny pushed people to see life as a sacred opportunity, not a meaningless accident. He reminded his audiences that every thought, every action, every intention carried weight beyond this life. In a 1943 reading, while the world was still engulfed in war, he declared that no soul is created to perish. Instead, each carries within it the imprint of God, like a seed encoded with eternal potential. But he also warned, just as a seed can remain buried in the ground without ever sprouting if denied water and light, a soul can wither if it refuses to grow. To many who heard this in Virginia Beach, the analogy was unforgettable. It meant that the greatest tragedy was not physical death but spiritual stagnation. This was a hard truth for people who expected simple answers about heaven or hell. Instead, Cayce described a reality where personal responsibility could not be escaped, where destruction was not inflicted from outside but chosen through neglect. And yet his words were never without hope, because just as a neglected seed can sprout when conditions change, a forgotten soul can reawaken when it turns once again toward love. One of the most controversial aspects of Cayce's teachings came when he tied the concept of soul destruction to selfishness and separation. He explained that when a person lives only for themselves, hoarding wealth, seeking power, ignoring the suffering of others, they cut themselves off from the very essence of life. During a session that stunned a group of businessmen in the early 1930s, he said, "Those who serve only self risk the death of the spirit." The room fell silent. These were men used to hearing sermons about salvation, but never about their personal responsibility for the state of their souls in practical daily choices. Cayce's words struck like thunder. Spiritual destruction wasn't about fire from heaven, but about becoming so self-absorbed that the soul starves of light. His warning echoed the biblical principle of losing your life to find it, reframed in a way that touched the fears of Depression-era America. For those men, it was not just philosophy, it was a challenge to change the way they lived. What made his message endure is that Cayce didn't leave people in despair. He always offered a path back to light. Service to others, prayer, meditation, and aligning daily choices with divine principles were the tools he prescribed. In one session, he told a grieving widow that every act of kindness she offered to others would not only heal their wounds, but reignite her husband's soul, helping it remember its purpose beyond the grave. That message gave her life new meaning. The idea that souls could risk destruction was terrifying, but the solution was deeply practical. Love one another, serve one another, seek God daily. For those who expected mystical formulas, Cayce's advice sounded almost simple, but that simplicity carried transformative power. Decades later, his words still ring true. The surest way to preserve the soul's light is to live not for the self, but for others. And this is where his vision connects to us today. In a culture often obsessed with material success, Cayce's warnings feel more relevant than ever. He spoke of people who lost themselves chasing temporary pleasures, their souls dimming in the process. He described how such choices created cycles of suffering across lifetimes until the soul remembered what truly mattered. Hearing this now, in an age of distraction, consumerism, and disconnection, is like a wake-up call. Are we nurturing our souls or starving them? Are we moving closer to God's ocean of love, or drifting into a desert of emptiness? These questions, asked nearly a century ago in Virginia Beach, still challenge us today. And Cayce's shocking vision, that souls cannot be erased but can waste themselves into oblivion, demands an answer from every one of us. In another reading often revisited in the ARE archives, Cayce was asked whether hell existed as a place of eternal punishment. His reply startled the church leaders present. Hell is not a place prepared by God. It is the condition of a soul separated from its source. He explained that this separation could feel like destruction because the soul, stripped of connection, drifts in darkness without direction. For those listening in the 1930s and 40s, when traditional theology dominated, this was radical. It meant that God was not condemning anyone to destruction. Instead, destruction was the natural result of choices made against the flow of divine love. But Cayce did not stop there. He reminded them that even the deepest darkness is not beyond God's reach. The moment a soul desires light again, no matter how far it has wandered, That spark is enough to begin its return. This gave hope to families who feared their loved ones had been lost forever. His vision was both severe and compassionate, severe in warning that choices matter eternally, compassionate in affirming that no one is abandoned by the Creator. Cayce often linked this teaching to the idea of reincarnation. Souls, he said, have many opportunities to correct their course. If one lifetime is wasted in selfishness, another may provide the chance to learn service and love. Yet he warned that ignoring this cycle over and over could lead to a state of spiritual numbness. In one session, he described such a soul as a wanderer without memory, existing but unaware of its true essence. To those who heard him, it sounded like the ultimate tragedy, not a fiery punishment, but a living oblivion. This was the destruction he spoke of, not annihilation but disconnection so deep that the soul's purpose seemed erased. And yet, even here, Cayce insisted that the Creator never abandoned the creation. Every soul remained written in the eternal record, waiting for the moment it would choose to awaken again. During the years after World War II, when many Americans were disillusioned and searching for new meaning, Cayce's perspective offered something different. He did not deny suffering, destruction, or despair. Instead, he reframed them as consequences of forgetting who we are. Souls, he said, were never meant to be destroyed. They were meant to evolve, to grow closer to God, to remember their divine origin. But free will meant they could also choose separation, creating their own suffering. This idea resonated in an era when people were wrestling with the horrors of war and the dawning of nuclear weapons, capable of destroying entire nations. Cayce's reminder that the soul itself was indestructible, but could experience destruction by choice, spoke directly to those fears. Humanity might destroy bodies and cities, but the eternal challenge was whether we would preserve the light within. And perhaps the most shocking part of his vision is how relevant it remains today. In our modern age, filled with noise, technology, and endless distraction, souls are at risk of forgetting their purpose just as much as they were during the Great Depression. Cayce's words echo like a warning bell. That which is eternal cannot be destroyed, but it may forget its source. He urged us not to take eternity for granted, but to live consciously, to guard the flame of spirit within. For anyone hearing this now, the question is unavoidable. Are we choosing light or drifting into shadows? Because according to Cayce, destruction is not something God does to us. It is something we do to ourselves by refusing the love that is always calling us back. One of the most haunting images Cayce ever gave came during a session when a desperate man asked him directly, "What becomes of the wicked soul?" Cayce, in deep trance, answered slowly that such a soul might become as if it never were, not because God erased it, but because it erased itself through rejection of divine purpose. This phrase terrified those who heard it, and yet it carried profound meaning. He was not describing a literal destruction of being, but the tragedy of self-chosen separation, where the soul forgets its true identity so completely that it seems lost to time. Imagine hearing those words during the 1930s, when fear and hopelessness were everywhere. For many, it created a shock that forced them to look at life differently. The man who asked the question left that session deeply shaken, but also determined to change his ways. Cayce's vision had planted a seed of accountability that sermons alone had never managed to awaken. To Cayce, the possibility of destruction was always linked with free will. God's love was infinite, but it never forced itself upon the soul. Each person, he explained, carries the choice in every moment to move toward unity or away from it. In the ARI archives, there are several documented sessions where people came seeking reassurance that their mistakes had not doomed them. Cayce always reminded them that as long as the desire for light still existed, no soul was beyond redemption. The soul is eternal in its essence, he said, but its awareness of that eternity depends on choice. For his listeners, this was both empowering and frightening. Empowering because it meant no one was ever fully lost. Frightening because it placed the responsibility squarely on their shoulders. What makes these teachings resonate across time is their honesty. Cayce did not sugarcoat the dangers of spiritual neglect. He spoke openly about the risk of becoming spiritually numb, of losing touch with the divine spark, yet he balanced every warning with hope. In one wartime session, a mother who had lost her son in battle asked if his soul had been destroyed. Cayce reassured her, "Your son's soul lives. He chose to serve, and service is eternal." These words, simple yet profound, lifted her grief. It showed that destruction was not an arbitrary fate, but the result of choices made over time. Her son, who had given his life for others, was preserved in light. For her, that was the greatest comfort imaginable. As decades passed, Cayce's legacy grew, and so did the impact of his vision about the soul. Scholars, seekers, and ordinary people alike continued to wrestle with his words. Was he suggesting annihilation? No. He made it clear that essence remains. But awareness, purpose, and joy can be lost if we live only for ourselves. That is why his warnings remain urgent. Souls may be eternal, but eternity without meaning is the closest thing to destruction we can imagine. His voice echoes across time, urging us to wake up, to serve, to remember who we are. And even today, in a world filled with both unprecedented possibility and profound despair, that warning has not lost its power. Cayce often reminded his listeners that the question of the soul's destruction was not about punishment from God, but about the soul's own relationship to truth. He explained that every soul was created in harmony, yet over time some chose to misuse free will, drifting away from their divine source. When this happens, the soul does not cease to exist, but it loses awareness of its eternal identity. In his words, this was the closest state to destruction: existence without meaning, energy without direction, life without light. He spoke about this in Virginia Beach to audiences who were desperate for clarity, many of whom had lost faith in religious institutions after the devastation of war and depression. His perspective gave them a new framework. Salvation was not about fear of eternal fire, but about remembering and restoring the connection with the divine. For people struggling to survive, this idea that their choices carried eternal consequences and eternal hope was a revelation that shook their daily lives. What makes this teaching so enduring is how Cayce balanced warning with compassion. He never left people in despair, even in his most shocking statements, such as describing a soul becoming as if it never were. He always added that God's mercy was greater than any separation. He said that even the most lost soul could rekindle its light if it turned back, even for a moment, toward love. This concept changed lives. A man who came to him in Kentucky during the 1920s, broken by guilt over his past, left with tears of relief after Cayce told him that no sin was greater than God's willingness to forgive. The possibility of destruction was real, but it was never final. That nuance is why people from all walks of life, from farmers to scholars, kept coming back to hear what the sleeping prophet would reveal next. Cayce's vision also had profound implications for how people understood reincarnation. If souls could lose awareness of themselves, then each lifetime became an opportunity, not just for growth but for rescue. He explained that reincarnation was a gift, a way for the soul to return to its lessons, to reclaim its light. In one reading, he described how a soul that had strayed far into selfishness could be born again into conditions that forced it to learn compassion. This was not punishment, but mercy, a way of restoring what seemed lost. For his audience, many of whom had been taught to fear eternal damnation, this was revolutionary. It meant no one was doomed forever, but it also meant that wasting life after life could lead to a condition of spiritual inertia, where the soul forgets its origin entirely. That was the destruction Cayce warned about, not an end, but an endless wandering without growth. For modern listeners, these teachings strike a deep chord. We live in an age of noise, distraction, and endless pursuit of material gain. It is easy to imagine how a soul could lose itself, how the light could be buried beneath layers of ambition, fear, and neglect. Cayce's shocking vision serves as a mirror for us today. Are we nourishing the flame within, or are we letting it fade into shadows? Are we serving others, or are we trapped in cycles of selfishness? These are not abstract questions. They are choices we make daily. And according to Cayce, Those choices determine whether our souls shine eternally or drift into the condition that feels like destruction. In one of his most remembered sessions, Cayce explained that the soul is like a lamp designed to shine forever. The oil, he said, is our alignment with divine principles, and the flame is our awareness of God within us. When the oil runs dry through selfishness, hatred, or indifference, the lamp does not shatter, but its light goes out. That condition, he warned, can last across lifetimes, giving the impression of destruction. For the people who heard this analogy during the Great Depression, it was unforgettable. They understood what it meant to have light and then lose it. Families who had once lived in abundance now lived in darkness, both physically and spiritually. Cayce's message was not just mystical poetry, it was a call to action. He urged them to keep their lamps filled with kindness, prayer, and service. The destruction of the soul was never about God extinguishing the flame. It was about neglecting the light until it no longer burned. One of the most powerful testimonies preserved in the archives tells of a family who came to Cayce in Virginia Beach, seeking hope for their son, a young man who had fallen into addiction. They feared he had ruined his soul forever. Cayce, in trance, responded with words that lifted the burden from their hearts. The soul is not destroyed, but it may forget its purpose. Yet in one moment of turning toward the light, the whole being can be renewed. Those words brought tears to their eyes. They understood that their son's choices carried consequences, but they also realized that as long as he breathed, as long as he carried even a spark of longing for God, he was never beyond redemption. This story spread quickly, inspiring others who struggled with despair to seek transformation instead of giving up. Cayce also spoke of collective souls, the destiny of humanity as a whole. He warned that societies driven by greed and violence risked entering a kind of collective darkness. During the war years, he cautioned that nations ignoring spiritual principles would find themselves in cycles of destruction. And yet, just as with individuals, he reminded his audience that no people were beyond renewal. Service, compassion, and turning back to God could restore the light of entire communities. These teachings were not abstract prophecies, but urgent instructions to a world on the edge of collapse. They remain relevant now, in an age when humanity faces not only war but ecological and spiritual crises. The warning stands: the soul, individual or collective, cannot be erased, but it can lose itself in shadows until it remembers its true source. What strikes most people when they first encounter these readings is how Cayce managed to blend warning with reassurance. He never denied the possibility of destruction, but he always left the door open to hope. He explained that the Creator's plan was eternal growth, not annihilation. If a soul drifted too far, God's love was still present, waiting patiently for the moment of return. This balance of accountability and mercy gave people courage. They no longer feared God as a punisher, but they respected the seriousness of their choices. For many, it was the first time spirituality felt both real and personal, no longer abstract theology, but a living truth that demanded action in daily life. As the years passed, Cayce's teachings about the soul's indestructibility and its potential for self-forgetting continued to resonate with those who studied his work. He insisted that no matter how far a soul wandered, it remained written in the book of life, what he often referred to as the Akashic records. These eternal records preserved every thought, every choice, and every lesson, ensuring that nothing was ever truly lost. Even if a soul seemed to fade into oblivion, its imprint in the records remained like a trail leading it back to its divine source. This was why Cayce always emphasized that destruction was never final. What people interpreted as annihilation was actually disconnection, and even the most disconnected soul could one day be guided back through prayer, service, and the persistent call of God's love. For his audiences in Virginia Beach, this gave profound comfort. It meant their efforts to live rightly were never wasted, and their loved ones were never beyond hope. One striking session, often recalled by those who attended, took place during World War II. A grieving father asked whether his son, killed in combat, had lost his soul because of the violence and hatred of war. Cayce answered with a gentleness that filled the room. "The soul is eternal. Death of the body does not mean death of the soul. Only by denying the spirit within can one approach destruction, and even then, the spark remains. The father wept openly, realizing that his son was not gone, but living in another dimension of reality. This kind of reassurance helped thousands endure the darkest years of the 20th century, but Cayce always paired comfort with responsibility. He reminded listeners that eternal survival did not guarantee eternal joy. Without conscious effort to live in harmony with divine law, the soul could wander in sorrow and emptiness for ages. Perhaps what made Cayce's view so revolutionary is that it removed fear-based theology and replaced it with spiritual accountability. He did not speak of a wrathful God eager to punish. He spoke of a loving Creator who allowed souls freedom, even the freedom to stray so far that they risked losing themselves. This, he explained, was the true meaning of hell. Not fire, not chains, but separation from God so profound that life felt meaningless. That was destruction, not of essence, but of awareness. For the men and women who heard this in Hopkinsville and Virginia Beach, it reframed everything they thought they knew about religion. They began to see daily choices as eternal decisions, shaping the destiny of their souls far more than rituals or dogmas ever could. Today, as we revisit these shocking visions, the same challenge remains before us. We cannot destroy our souls, but we can neglect them into darkness. We cannot erase our divine origin, but we can forget it so deeply that we live as though it never existed. Cayce's words, spoken nearly a century ago, are still a mirror for our times. Will we choose the path of light or drift into shadows? The answer is written not in sermons or doctrines, but in the choices we make daily, in kindness, in service, in love. And as Cayce said again and again, the moment a soul turns back toward the light, even after centuries of wandering, God's response is always the same. Welcome home. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Cayce's teachings is that when he spoke about the possibility of destruction, he never meant annihilation in the literal sense. He clarified in multiple sessions that the soul, being of God, could not be erased from existence. What could be destroyed was its awareness, its memory of purpose, its flame of connection. This is why he often warned that selfishness, cruelty, and neglect of spiritual growth were far more dangerous than physical death. A body could die in an instant, but the soul lived on. Yet if a soul carried only bitterness and separation, it risked entering states of confusion so deep that it wandered without direction. This was not punishment, but consequence, like drifting into a fog of one's own making. His listeners often gasped when he explained this, realizing that the condition of their inner life was far more important than any external achievement or reputation. Cayce's vision was consistent with his broader teachings about reincarnation and the evolution of consciousness. He explained that every lifetime is an opportunity to bring the soul closer to its source. But he also warned that lifetimes spent in neglect could add up, creating inertia that felt like destruction. Imagine carrying patterns of selfishness, hatred, or indifference across multiple incarnations. Eventually, the soul becomes heavy, burdened, and forgetful. This, Cayce said, was the danger. Yet even then, he insisted, God's love remained constant like the sun shining even on the darkest clouds. The soul might forget the sun, but the sun never forgot the soul. This assurance balanced the gravity of his warnings with the promise of redemption. Families in Virginia Beach and beyond clung to this hope, especially when faced with loss, despair, or fear of eternal damnation. During a session that deeply moved those present, Cayce described how even souls who had turned away from God for ages were still given opportunities to return. He said, "No soul is ever beyond the hand of the Creator. What seems destruction is but delay." This line became one of the most repeated in ARE study groups because it reframed despair as temporary. Even if a soul wasted centuries, the moment it turned toward love, it was welcomed back into the eternal flow. That balance, between the risk of losing oneself and the certainty of God's mercy, made Cayce's message unlike any other. It was not about fear, but about responsibility. It was not about condemnation, but about the urgency of remembering. For us today, these teachings still demand reflection. In a world filled with distractions, it is easy to let our souls fall asleep, to bury the flame beneath endless noise. Cayce's shocking vision reminds us that the greatest danger is not death but forgetfulness. We are eternal beings, but eternity without awareness is a kind of destruction we must avoid. And the way to avoid it, as Cayce repeated countless times, is simple yet profound. Live with love, serve others, pray daily, and align your choices with the divine. This, he insisted, was the surest protection for the soul. It is a message that spoke to the hearts of his generation, and it continues to speak to ours, urging us to guard the light within as the most precious treasure we have. In many ways, Cayce's vision of the soul is a message of accountability wrapped in hope. He wanted people to understand that eternal life was not a guarantee of eternal joy. To live selfishly, to ignore the inner call of spirit, was to risk a state of emptiness that felt like destruction. But to live with compassion, service, and prayer was to keep the soul alive and radiant forever. In one 1932 session, preserved in the archives, Cayce emphasized that the soul is the spark of the Creator and cannot be destroyed. Yet it may lose itself, and to lose oneself is the greatest tragedy. That phrase struck the audience like lightning. It shifted the focus of their faith away from fear of punishment and toward the responsibility of daily choices. To Cayce, the greatest question was not where we would go after death, but whether we would recognize ourselves when we arrived. The families who came to him in Virginia Beach often left with a new sense of purpose. A grieving mother once asked him if her daughter, who had died young, was safe. Cayce assured her that the child's soul was safe in the arms of light, but then he turned the focus back on the mother. The question is not whether her soul is safe, but whether yours will remain awake. That balance of comfort and challenge defined his entire body of work. He was not content to give reassurance alone. He wanted people to act, to live consciously, to guard their souls from the slow erosion of selfishness and despair. This was why his teachings, though sometimes unsettling, became a source of transformation for thousands who sought his guidance. As we reflect on these shocking revelations, we see a pattern. Destruction is not about annihilation, but about separation. The soul cannot be erased because it belongs to God, but it can forget who it is. That forgetting is the true danger, and the cure, Cayce said, is always the same. Awaken to love, align with service, seek God in every choice. When we do this, the light within grows brighter, and the possibility of destruction fades away. This vision, though delivered in the 1930s and 40s, speaks directly to our lives today. In a world full of temptations to forget ourselves, his words echo like a call across time. Remember who you are, for you are eternal. So the question remains, can souls be destroyed? According to Edgar Cayce, the answer is both shocking and comforting. No soul can ever cease to exist, but a soul can lose itself so completely that it lives as though destroyed. The warning is real, but so is the promise. God's love is always waiting, ready to reignite even the faintest spark. The choice is ours every day, in every action. And that is the vision Cayce left us. Not a theology of fear, but a path of responsibility, where each soul has the power to preserve its own eternal light. Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Do you believe a soul can truly be destroyed, or do you believe it only forgets its divine source? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll mark each one with a heart, because your perspective matters in this community. And if this message touched you, don't forget to like, share this video with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you won't miss the next revelation from the life and work of Edgar Cayce.